Dr. Thompson, the vet, had a pallid expression on his face. He still had not spoken to the Johnson family. He simply quietly gathered his belongings. Dr. Thompson, Mrs. Johnson cautiously questioned, "Do you have an explanation for this?" But all he could manage was to mutter. What was happening? The veterinarian began, "I'm sorry." Mrs. Johnson was shocked to hear "I'm sorry, but this isn't a foal." "No foal, then," she pondered. "What else is it possibly?" What, though, was happening with Daisy's foal? Why was the vet behaving in such an odd way? And how did Daisy actually become pregnant? The Johnson family maintained a modest farm in a small community tucked away in the middle of the countryside. The Johnson family had operated their farm for many generations, and they were well known in the neighborhood for their devotion to and concern for their livestock, especially Daisy, their treasured horse. Everyone in the village liked Daisy, a stunning black horse with a kind disposition. She had never been used for breeding because the Johnsons kept her largely as a pet. So when they observed Daisy acting abnormally one spring morning, it was a huge surprise. She was clearly in discomfort as she was pacing back and forth in her stall, whinnying and stomping her hooves on the floor. Mrs. Johnson, a seasoned horsewoman, had previously observed this behavior and had the strange suspicion that Daisy, who had not displayed any pregnancy symptoms, might be in labor. Dr. Thompson, the neighborhood vet, was phoned by the Johnsons right away, and he headed out to the farm as quickly as he could. He was Daisy's trusted veterinarian and had been for many years. An apprehensive Mr. Johnson welcomed him and escorted him to Daisy's stall when he arrived. Dr. Thompson quickly evaluated Daisy's condition after arriving at her stall. He was able to discern that she was in labor and that the foal was about to be born. Mrs. Johnson was puzzled by this. How could Daisy have become pregnant if no stallion had been in the same stall with her or even in the same meadow? However, she soon saw it was the least of her issues. Daisy needed all the assistance she could get as she prepared to give birth. Fortunately, Dr. Thompson had brought all the required tools and had everything ready for when he needed to utilize it. Daisy had to first experiment on her own. Daisy was just in the early stages of labor, according to Dr. Thompson. All they could do was wait because active labor might start in a few hours or up to a day. Mrs. Johnson, however, was not a patient person. She needed to know who gave Daisy birth. She might learn more about the foal from that, perhaps. After another event that happened on the farm many years earlier, they hung cameras all over it, so all Mrs. Johnson had to do was watch the tape. Thus, she acted. She basically went back to the location where Daisy was allegedly impregnated as she scanned the video. Mrs. Johnson didn't take long to discover anything really odd. Mrs. Johnson opened her eyes in disbelief as she watched the video. She was in awe of what she was observing. Daisy had first been by herself in her stall on the alleged night she became pregnant. But suddenly she caught a glimpse of something unusual on the webcam. A gate was opened, and a stallion entered. Mrs. Johnson recognized right away that this was a planned attack. But who and why would act in such a manner? What benefit did they receive from it? They gathered around the computer screen to examine the puzzling film after she contacted her husband and Dr. Thompson. The stallion was then instantly recognizable to her. Rocky, their neighbor's stallion, was the animal. Rocky had been acting suspiciously for a few weeks, but Mrs. Johnson never suspected he was the reason Daisy became pregnant. But as she focused her gaze, she discovered something about which no one appeared to be aware. This was quite odd. Rocky's owner was a widowed guy, thus it was surprising that it appeared as though a woman had opened Daisy's stall for Rocky. He had long since lost his wife and had been living by himself. Thompson swiftly made his way back to Daisy's side because he had nothing to do with the neighbor or their stallion. Given her predicament, he didn't want to abandon her for an extended period of time. Mr. and Mrs. Johnson lingered behind for a little while longer, attempting to identify whose hand they were seeing. Mrs. Johnson was unable to ponder the weird feminine hand because Dr. Thompson called to inform her that Daisy was currently in active labor. Daisy was lying on the ground in distress when Mrs. Johnson hastily returned to her stall and discovered her. Dr. Thompson grinned and added, "It won't be long now." Mrs. Johnson, however, was unable to grin back. She was quite concerned for her horse because she appeared to be suffering greatly. Daisy wasn't sure what to anticipate because this was her first pregnancy. They also neglected to monitor the foal's health because Mrs. Johnson was unaware of the pregnancy. Daisy was having powerful rhythmic contractions because you could see her abdominal muscles moving noticeably in and out. Daisy, however, did not remain lying on the ground. Instead, she turned around, stood up, paced the cubicle, and then lay back down. She appeared extremely agitated, but that would soon pass. They hoped, that is. As Mrs. Johnson saw her restless horse, her heart began to race. She sincerely wanted to assist her, but there wasn't much she could do. Her spouse gently grasped her hand and squeezed it after noticing her stressed-out expression. He smiled slightly as they locked eyes, reassuring her. Daisy was exhaling heavily, and Mrs. Johnson was concerned for her priceless stallion. Dr. Thompson, though, reassured her that everything would be okay. Daisy's behavior couldn't be ignored, even though Mrs. Johnson knew she had to trust her veterinarian. The mare's eyes were wide with worry and sweat was streaming down her cheeks. Dr. Thompson was the veterinarian, but Mrs. Johnson was quite familiar with her horse. As a result, she didn't disregard her intuition that something wasn't right. She informed Dr. Thompson once more that there was a problem, but his response remained the same. Mrs. Johnson realized she needed to take action at that point. Mrs. Johnson found it tough to stand on the sidelines and observe. Daisy needed assistance, and because Dr. Thompson was not going to provide it, she was forced to step in. Yet how? She tried to come up with a plan to distract him from the horse, but she was at a loss for ideas. When she turned to face her husband, he could sense her anxiety. Thompson was constantly by Daisy's side. Then Mr. Johnson understood instantly what needed to be done. He purposefully tripped after taking a few steps backwards despite being aware of something behind him. Dr. Thompson and Mrs. Johnson both let out a gasp as they heard Mr. Johnson stumble. Although he shouted in agony, the pain wasn't that bad. He used exaggeration to grab Dr. Thompson's attention, and it was effective because Dr. Thompson ran over to Mr. Johnson and assisted him in standing up. However, it wasn't enough. To prevent him from noticing his wife, Mr. Johnson realized he had to entice Dr. Thompson even further away from the horse. He needed to get somewhere undetectable where Dr. Thompson couldn't see him in the stall. And Mr. Johnson was adept at doing that. Mr. Johnson sobbed in agony as he clutched his hand by his head. "It hurts in my head." Dr. Thompson, who was by his side holding his arm, couldn't refuse. He looked at Mrs. Johnson in the hope that she would reply, "I'll do it," but she remained silent. "I have to lie down," he whispered sickly. "Can you help me inside? I'll be back in a second. Keep a close eye on Daisy, and don't get too close," Dr. Thompson said when he and Mr. Johnson stumbled away. Mrs. Johnson, though, was unwilling to listen. She was aware that her horse required a tender touch. She therefore cautiously entered Daisy's stall. Daisy's breathing began to ease slightly as soon as Mrs. Johnson gently touched her back. She gave the horse a gentle pat on the back to tell her that everything would be fine. Then Mrs. Johnson noticed Daisy's tail and realized her foal was soon due. But something wasn't right. Daisy had been giving birth for quite some time, and the foal ought to have arrived by now. Daisy attempted to push, and Mrs. Johnson peered till she understood what was happening. The foal was lying broken. This was a very, very awful situation that would not go away. They had to assist Daisy or it might turn out terrible for them both. She was aware that because she was an amateur veterinarian, she couldn't handle this on her own. Even if it meant admitting she disobeyed Dr. Thompson's requests, she felt she had to tell him about her results. She placed a lot more value on Daisy's health than she did on a brief conversation with the veterinarian. Soon after Dr. Thompson left again, Mrs. Johnson quickly described what she had observed. Fortunately, the vet ultimately gave in after realizing how critical the situation was. He concurred with Mrs. Johnson that they needed to help the foal immediately find a better position. Every second mattered. Dr. Thompson instantly made a contact for extra veterinary support because the matter needed to be handled right away. A group of vets soon arrived at the farm to help with the difficult birth. Assisting Daisy with her delivery, Dr. Thompson and his group of veterinary professionals put in endless hours of effort and used all of their knowledge and resources. They carefully examined the foal's position and determined that it was in the breech position, which indicated that it was emerging from the mother's womb with its back instead of its head. Because it could result in difficulties and put Daisy and the foal in danger, this complicated situation needed to be addressed right away. Dr. Thompson and his team skillfully moved the breech foal into the ideal position for delivery with concentrated precision. They made sure the foal's legs were set up correctly to reduce the possibility of harm to Daisy or the foal by moving slowly but firmly. It was a delicate and difficult operation that called for rapid thought and deft handling. Mrs. Johnson, meanwhile, stood on the sidelines hopelessly watching. She felt terrible seeing her cherished horse go through that. Although she was aware that pregnancy and childbirth carry some risks, this particular labor stood out from all the others she had seen. She had animosity toward whoever victimized her beloved Daisy in this way. She made the decision that since she couldn't help with the birth, she would visit her neighbor's farm and show him the video. He swiftly opened the door with a bewildered expression as she yelled angrily at him. "Mrs. Johnson, what's the matter? I was just eating dinner. Your dinner can wait. What have you done to Daisy?" Philip, her next-door neighbor, gave Mrs. Johnson a perplexed look. He scowled. "I have no idea what you are talking about." The resolute Mrs. Johnson responded, "Well, I'll show you." She entered the room and placed her laptop on the desk. "Please explain this, Philip." and she pressed play. Daisy was filmed by herself in her bathroom cubicle. They observed as Daisy's stall door abruptly opened, and the neighbor's stallion was put inside along with her. The horses were initially a little perplexed, but given their temperament and the fact that they were both in reproductive shape, it didn't take them long to catch on. Philip couldn't believe his eyes. He was innocent, but the stallion in the video was his. He attempted to tell Mrs. Johnson this, but she was too blinded by her rage to hear him. Philip rewatched the footage and noticed something new this time. There was an abrupt wait from him. To paraphrase, "I know whose hand that is."